Okay, today I'm going to show you how to make a little pin cushion of your own, just like this. A little tiny pin cushion that you could actually stick your pins and needles in. So it's kind of a useful little project that hopefully you'll use, and remember that it's the first thing you've sewn. So to make this little pin cushion, we're going to use the two 4x4" pieces that we prepped earlier. So I've got my pieces, I've got a ruler, pencil, scissors for now, needle and thread, and I'll talk about some other supplies in just a moment. Remember, these are the pieces that are exactly 4 inches by 4 inches, and we've pulled threads 2 inches going on the cross grain, and also 2 inches on the length grain. So 2 inches and 2 inches all the way across, and then we've actually also pulled threads a 1/2 inch all the way across on all 4 sides. So what it ends up looking like is this. So here you can see that I've pulled all the threads and they go all the way. So we have this nice grid, and in the center we end up having a little 3-inch square, and that's ultimately what our pin cushion is going to be. A 3-inch square with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, and its center grain lines are pulled both directions, so we'll easily be able to see that it is perfectly square, right on grain. So we've got our 2 pieces, and you've pulled grains on both, and what we'll need to do is start marking them out for our stitch length. So we're going to do a 1/4 inch back stitch on these. If we sewed these on a sewing machine, we would have 2 sets of thread, the top and the bobbin, that would come together and interlock, making a really nice strong stitch. So because we're going to sew it by hand, we still want a really nice strong stitch. The back stitch that we did is the best option because it's going to look the same on both sides, and for every stitch we go forward, we also go back. So it's going to be really good to make sure that it's super strong and our seam here doesn't come open. See how we've got that seam? None of the filling is coming out. We've got a nice tight seam with the back stitch. So that's the stitch that we're going to do, and we're going to do it nice and small at a 1/4 inch. So what we can do is go ahead and mark that with our ruler. So I only need to be marking on this inside square. I won't be making stitches that go all the way across to the edges. If you think about where I'm going to sew, I'm going to sew from here to that point, turn, and sew here to that point, turn here to that point, turn, and sew again. Okay, so when I'm marking my stitches, I don't need to go all the way to these edges. I'm not actually going to be sewing out there. I'm going to sew to these points and stop. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get those marked, set up my ruler, sew a 1/4 inch from the edge, give myself some nice marks, and it'll look like this. And see how I know I'm getting it right? Because look, I've got one that's going to be right there at the center, and look, just like basically this little grid here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So I've got 1.5 inches, and then another 1.5 inches that's making my 3. So I will mark these all the way around. Other side, And I'm just doing it right on the line where I pulled the green line thread. So it makes it really easy for me to sew in a straight line and hit all the right points. Okay, so I've got a 1/4 inch marked all the way around for this. So what we're going to want to do is sew these two pieces together. So I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side. I'm going to mark all my 1/4 inches seam, or sorry, my stitch length all the way around. So I'll go ahead and do that on this side. Even though I drew on this side, but yours won't look like this because you wouldn't have drawn on yours. You would have just pulled the threads. So I have got these both marked with my 1/4 inch stitch length all the way around. And now I'm going to start putting them together to mark them and make sure that we're lining them up just right. And so this is where we're actually sewing two pieces together, so we could use pins to hold them together. So I'm going to put this one on top so you don't see all my writing, which is on this. I'm going to line it up as best I can, but I could also take a pin and I could put it in, say, a corner, and then check and see that it's hitting the exact same spot on the piece underneath, which it is. It's going right through that same corner. This is a little trick that I can make sure now these two pieces are lined up exactly on that corner. So what I can do now is maybe move my pin over within the seam allowance. I don't want to pin right on the line where I'm going to be sewing because then it'll get in my way. But if I move the pin over here, it's not in my way. And so I can check the other corners too. So I can just stick that right in the corner and then just move that layer and see, like, it's a little off, right? It's not exactly in that corner, so I'll just go ahead and move it and put it right in that corner. And then let the two kind of fall how they will. I could even leave that pin in there temporarily while I grab another to put in my seam allowance, and that way it hasn't moved its perfect spot. And then I can take that out and I can check this corner, do the same thing. It's close but still not perfect, so I'll go ahead and move it to the right spot. And then same, I'll come take another pin, put it in the seam allowance. And then I can take this one out, and finally I can check my last corner, see how that one's going. That one's a little off as well, so I'll put that right where it needs to go. And then I'll pin on the side. And you can check and see, kind of moving your pins around if you need to. This is feeling like these two pieces are now lined up really equally. And it's going to just make your life so much easier when you go to sew, because that way you'll know when I'm going through this hole, I'll be hitting the same hole on the other side, which in this case is like in there, but that's the idea. And again, you can test it at any point. Be like, am I hitting? Will I hit that exact mark? Pretty much, yeah. And you've got a little bit of variance, you know, just a tiny bit. If it's, you know, not lining up super precise, we're aiming for a really accurate precision here, but it is fabric, so it does move a little bit. So that's okay if that happens, but you're really trying to be as precise as possible. So get it all pinned and ready to go. And then what we need to kind of plan for is that we're going to sew this up so that we can fill it with fluffy material. But in order to do that, we're going to need to leave a little hole, a little space somewhere, so we can plan for where we want that to be. I don't really want it to be on a corner or on an end, because then it's going to be really hard to get my nice little point on the end of my pillow here. It's going to be a difficult area to sew at the end. So I want to put my hole right in the center somewhere. So pick one of your long straight lines and aim for the center, and let's leave an opening of 1 inch. So what's going to happen is you're going to put your ruler, your 1/2 inch line, right on your pulled grain, right? So there's my opening. I'll have a 1/2 inch on this side, a 1/2 inch on this side. This way it's perfectly centered. So I've got a 1 inch opening. What I'll do is I'm just going to draw straight lines up so I know right now. So basically from this point to this point will be my opening. When I sew my back stitch all the way around, what I will actually do is start here. So, and then I will end here. Okay, so I won't sew this last inch. I will leave that open, then I can put my fluff inside, and then we will sew this up with a different stitch at the end. Okay, so make sure you are prepped to this point. You've got your 1/4 inch stitch length marked all the way out. You're pinned so that your 2 pieces are perfectly lined up, and that you've got your little opening marked for 1 inch in the center of one of the sides. And then we can start sewing. Okay, so we're all prepped and ready to go. So we're ready to start sewing. So we're going to get our red or black thread. I want to be able to see it. And we're going to thread our needle and get it all set. And because we are not just sewing a sample this time, we're sewing for real. We want this pin cushion to hold up and last and be a really good strong pin cushion. Let's do what I've kind of talked about a few times. Let's do double thread. So I've got my needle threaded. I'm going to pull, and maybe I start with, this is maybe like 15 to 18 inches, but see what I've done is pulled so that I have two pieces of thread that are equal length. This is just going to make our stitch really, really strong. And I'm going to come down to the end and cut. So see how I've got 2 pieces of thread. And then I'm going to do the same knot that we've been doing. I'm just going to tie it on itself, kind of like a balloon. Pull it down and then do a double knot so it doesn't come through. Tie it on itself again. And to make sure the 2 knots line up, I'm just kind of gliding that knot down to the other. So now I've got a double knot with my 2 threads. I can trim this excess so it's nice and short, and that's like not in my way. And now what's nice is my needle won't fall off. It's like dangling, it's contained because it's basically like a needle necklace at this point. So that's also really handy. So I've got a good, nice long bit of thread, and I can start sewing with my back stitch. So with the back stitch, remember we're going to come from behind. So I'm going to come from underneath, right on this point where I've decided is the first stitch that I'm going to make for my opening. I'm coming from underneath. I'm going to pull all the way till my knot stops me. And I'm going to go forward to that next line. And then because we're kind of starting this back stitch, we always want to make sure when we're sewing for this particular project that it's going to not have any gapping on the front or the back. So here I've got a stitch sewn from here to here. There's no gap. And on the back there is. So I'm going to want to go ahead and come backwards right away and go right back into that first stitch that I made. Oops, I'm getting a little knot. There we go. So now it looks the same on the front as it does on the back, right? I've got my little 1/4 inch stitch. And then this seems sort of like overkill, but it's actually really good since this will be our opening. To continue, I'm going to go into this stitch again. So it seems like we're just going over that same spot several times, but it'll be a good way to start. It'll really lock our stitch in place. So now we can do kind of what our regular stitch is. I'm coming from behind, and I'm going to come to the next mark. And now this is what we think of where we go back towards ourselves. So I'm going to go back into this last stitch that we came out of here. Oops. And just make sure your tension is nice throughout. Don't pull too taut. So here we've got 2 stitches on the back, 2 stitches on the front. Okay? And it should look like that the entire time. If ever you look at one side or the other and you have a white gap where your stitch length is, then that means you need to go back and kind of fill that space in. You need to either pull out the last few stitches or go back and fill that gap. Okay, so now again I'm coming from behind and I'm coming into the next point that I have marked. Pull that thread, and then I'm going to go back towards myself. There we go. And again, I've got 3 stitches, I've got 3 stitches. Looks good, right? It's all coming back to you. The corners, we're going to change it up a little bit because we haven't really wrapped around a corner, but I'll show you how we do it. So we come to that corner, pull it through, I go back towards myself. And see how this is happening? Since we've got pins in here, your thread's going to want to try to like wrap around all your pins. So just go nice and slow and be careful. But see, now I've got all my threads, my stitches on this side, got my stitches on this side. And the next thing that I would want to do is basically start sewing onto this line here. But if I just come right now, right into the next stitch marked, watch what happens. I'm going to show you from the back. Oops. Got a knot too. All kinds of things are happening. It's going to go across. It's not going to come down at this really nice point that I want. It's going across, and I don't want that. I want really nice sharp points. I'm going to attempt to put this back through the same exact hole that I just did. Perfect, I did it. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to come right back to this next mark. What I want to do is set myself up. So even though it seems like I'm just going over the same thing, I'm going to make this point nice and strong. I'm just going to go into this end here. So it's like just one little stitch up there. There we go. And then I can go to this next mark. There we go. And I have a nice right angle right here, a nice point. I haven't crossed over. But then here, I have a gap. So again, I'll just fill that gap. I'll go right up to this spot. There we go. And now I have a nice right angle here and a nice right angle here. And then to get me back where I need to be so that I'm basically coming from underneath every time, I'll just do the same thing I did as in the beginning. I'll go right to this little spot right here. So again, just like we did here, we've kind of really tacked in that first stitch. We've really tacked in these corner stitches. Again, worst case, it'll just be really great. Those would be really strong areas. So now I can continue as sort of normal. I'll go to the next stitch marked, and I'll come back towards myself. There we go. So now I've got 2 stitches, and look, now I've got 2 stitches, and both sides look the same. Really nice and neat and pretty, right? That's what we want. So I'll hit the next mark. And then see how sometimes, especially when you're sewing with 2 pieces of thread, they're going to try to knot on you or try to bunch up, especially if you've got a really long bit. So just take your time. If that happens, just work out the little knot with your fingers. Just go nice and slow, adjusting the thread every so often so that doesn't happen. Sometimes when it gets all twisty, I'll just let the thread sort of hang on its own, let the needle kind of dangle and work those twists out. Okay, so I'm going back towards myself, from behind, up to the next mark, back towards the last stitch, up to the next mark, and definitely check every so often, look at the back, make sure you don't have any knots, make sure it's doing what you want it to do. It's easier to pull out, just one stitch and fix it than to have to pull out your whole project and fix it. So always be checking. Oops, again, stuck on these pins. And then back. You can see it's the same on both sides. From behind, and really aim for precision and accuracy. You took the time to mark out all those stitches, so go ahead and make sure that you're actually getting them stitched in the right place. It's hard for me, I want to go so fast, I just want to do it. But especially since this is your first time, let's really make this a perfect sample. The idea being that you could go back and say, this is a perfect example of what this looks like. And then I've hit the corner again, so I'll just check that we're looking good. Looks the same, no gaps. And again, I don't just want to come across sideways to start going down that other line. I want to go ahead and come right into that corner, and then I can make my turn where I can control it. And again, coming from behind, I don't want to just skip that gap. I want to make sure I fill it. So I'm going to come right into that corner again, and we are just really going to reinforce those corners. And to get me going in the right direction, I'll come right back in there, and here now I'm ready to go again. Come from behind and then back towards that last stitch. From behind and back towards that last stitch. From behind and back towards that last stitch. And you can see I'm kind of starting to run out of thread here, so even my 15 or 18 inches was not quite enough to do the whole project. And obviously that's going to happen. You can't always be working with like 2 miles of thread to sew your entire piece. So at some point you're going to get to a place where you've got to stop and tie a knot and do more thread. And in this case, look, I'm like halfway through, right? And I've got, it's about maybe 2 inches left. I could keep going, but really it just makes it harder to deal with. The further you go, makes it harder to tie a knot. So what I could do, a couple of things. I could stop right here, and I could separate these 2 pieces, cut it, and I could just tie them into a little double knot right there and trim it. Or I'll show you what I typically do, so I don't even have to do that. I'm just going to get this pin out of the way. We don't need it right now anymore because we've actually sewn up those 2 pieces, so it's not even holding anything together. But what I usually do is I come from what I consider maybe is like the bad side or the wrong side or the inside, and I'll just grab like a few stitches into the seam allowance, right? So I wouldn't want to do anything that I'm going to see. This is going to be my pretty 3-inch square. This I'll never see. This will be turned towards the inside. So I can just grab a few stitches there, go through, and then come in, and I'll loop through this bubble, and look how I've just tied a knot right there without even having to like deal with both of those threads. And then you usually do want to double knot it so it doesn't come right out, and I'll do the same thing. So that's my like quick, easy way to just tie this off with a good strong double knot. I'll snip it. And again, I'll never see this. It's inside the seam allowance. You don't see it from this side. You see that one little pick here, but that's just a really easy way to do it. So now I'll get some more thread, and I'll show you how to start again if you're starting in the middle of a project like that. Let me see if I can thread this. Ooh, there we go. Okay, so again, I'm going to get double. I'll take at least as much as I had last time, maybe even a little bit more, because I've got about halfway through. So now I have a better estimation of how much I need. Got my 2 threads, come to the bottom. Make sure they're ending at the same point, and tie them into a double knot. Okay, oops, trim this excess there. And now I can start where I left off. Okay, so we'll continue saying this is like the bottom of my project and this is the top. And so what we need to do is start at this next stitch length up. Okay, and I think this is going to set us up for success. So I'm coming from behind at this next stitch length. There we go. And now I'm going to go back to catch that other stitch, back towards the last stitch. There we go. And now I'm coming from, whoops, behind. And now I'll go up to the next one, the next mark, and back towards the last stitch. And this should be like nothing ever happened. Oops, got a little knot back there. There we go. So no gaps. That's just where my little knots are. It continues really evenly. Okay, so that's what we want. It's like nobody knows we even stopped our thread and started a new one. That's the goal. So back towards the last stitch, from behind. And again, when you start out and you've really got a long bit of thread, it's just so many places that it can try to form little knots. So definitely check the back pretty often and make sure it's going through nice and evenly. From behind at the next mark, and then back towards the last stitch. And here we've got our corner again. From behind, back towards the last stitch. Okay, and again I'm going to go into that corner so I can get a nice hard angle before I turn, and then I'll go to the next stitch, and then I'll come from behind and fill that gap going back towards the last stitch. Okay, and to continue, I'll go right into there again, and now I'm good to go. I'm coming from behind. I could hit the next mark. Perfect. I've got a nice hard 90-degree angle there. And then back towards the last stitch. from behind at the next mark, back towards the last stitch, from behind at the next mark. Oh, got a little knot. You can feel it when it's happening. You're like, something went wrong. Let me check. Back towards the last stitch. Looking good. Kind of seems like I crossed over at that point, but I think it'll be okay once I pull one more. So from behind, back towards the last stitch, from behind. Oh, I can feel those knots. Back towards the last stitch. From behind. Back towards the last stitch. And just check. I've got a nice straight line on both sides. Almost done. From behind. Back towards the last stitch. From behind. Back towards the last stitch. From behind. Back towards the last stitch. Coming up on my last corner. And again, if you look and something went terribly awry, go back and pull it out. Just pull out up to that point. You can tie off a little knot. You don't have to pull out the whole thing, just to the point where the threads got mixed up. So I'm at the corner again, so I'm going to go right back into that spot. See, so I'm right at the corner, and then I make my turn. There we go. And to fill that gap, I'll go into that corner stitch again, and even one more time. There we go. And now I can come from behind and back towards my last stitch, and from behind and back towards my last stitch, and from behind, and that's my last stitch. That's going to be my opening, back towards my last stitch. And now I'm just going to make sure that I don't have any gapping. And so here, oh, looks like I actually had a little piece of thread that didn't get pulled all the way. And sometimes that happens too. You can just go back and make sure. See how I just pulled on that and then it came right up? I can make sure my tension's good. If you catch it early on, see how I can just slide it. There we go, right to the right place. So now that's a much better tension. So move that pin out of the way. So see how my thread's coming from mid. So just like at my corners, I don't really want my thread to end here. I want to kind of reinforce that. So I'm going to go right to the end and make sure my thread is now right on the end, just like this ends right on the end. So I'll do the same thing where I tied off midway before. I'll go into the seam allowance a little bit, just like a little, just like right there by the edge. And I'll get a few, just a few grains. And I'll come up and then I'll go through my own loop and make a little knot. And I'll do it one more time to just make sure it's nice and secure. Pull that nice and taut. And now I can clip it. Okay, and so now I've got this sewn pretty much all the way up. Take my pins out, put them in my pin cushion that you will soon have. And now we're almost ready to flip this and basically make it into the thing that it really is. So what you can do at this point, this is all now seam allowance. It's extra. It's going to get turned towards the inside. You could trim some of this up if you want, so it's not so bulky on the inside of your pincushion. So what I mean by that is I can trim about halfway. So I've got a 1/2 inch. I can trim this down to 1/4 of an inch. I don't want to go much more than that. I don't want to get close to my stitches because see how this stuff frays? If I get really close, well, it could just fray and then come undone, and then my stitches won't be stitched into anything. I'm going to leave this side nice and long. I think it'll be easier for me to sew this later if this is a nice long piece that I can tuck towards the inside. I'll show you what I mean. But the rest of it I could trim, and you don't have to at all. But it just makes it a little easier to turn it inside out if there's kind of less to have to worry about. And see here, that was where, remember, I tied my knot. So make sure if you're trimming that you're not cutting into anything that you did. I could also take my corners and trim in sort of this shape if you want to help turn it. So I can take my extra trimmings and set them aside. We'll actually use those in just a minute. So now I want to turn this inside out so that I don't end up seeing this stitch, and instead I just see my pretty tiny pillow, my pretty pincushion. So see how I've basically created like this little bag with this little hole. So what I've got to do is now turn everything inside out so I can flip it over. So I kind of start with my finger and just push it. You can also use, like with your scissors together, you can use the bit of your scissors, but sometimes I do push too hard and rip it, so I don't want that to happen. So go nice and gentle, but it's starting to turn inside out. And what I'll have to do, once I get most of it, is probably get my finger back in there and push out the edges. Okay, so I can go down to the corners, and what I want, like this pincushion, I want these nice crisp corners that we took all our time to sew. I don't want it to look rounded. I don't want to lose anything. I really want to make sure I'm getting all that fabric out. So I'll come down to my corners first. Again, if you can't get this with your finger, like I said, use like the size of your scissors really carefully, or pencil, something like that. But see, I'm really going to try to get that nice corner. This one's a little more rounded. Let me see. It's like there's a point that you don't want to push it so far that you like accidentally rip it open. But there, look at that. Those are nice points, right? That looks like a square. And now what happened to our points up here? This does not look like this. They're lost in there. Okay, so let's go back in with our finger and find that point. Oh, there you are, point. I thought we'd lost you. So see if you can work it out. And you can start to flip that 1/2 inch here on your opening to the inside. Oh, look, we're almost there. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 corners. We just need to get this one. So go back in to the opening and see if you can work on that last corner. Kind of pull those pieces apart. Okay. So now we have our tiny little square. It looks like this, right? Before we even think about filling anything, really work on those corners. Make sure they are pulled out as much as you can get them, okay? We want nice little sharp corners if you can get it. Something like this will be pretty good. And again, you can take your scissors, or if you have tinier like embroidery scissors, and see how I can kind of push on that corner, and sometimes I can get like a little more to come out, but I mean gently so that you're not cutting through. Okay, but look, now I've got 4 sharp corners. It's my little pillow bag. And then naturally what happened is that 1/2 inch just turned toward the inside here, right? And that looks nice and easy. We can still see where we've marked our stitches. We can see our stitch lines. So that's going to be easy for us to sew. So what we need to do now is fill it to get it to look like this. So you can use fiber fill, which is what this one's full of. It's the stuff that comes out of stuffed animals. This is polyfiberfill, so it's just like spun polyester in this really fine filaments. You can buy a whole bag of it. I didn't want to make you guys have to buy something else because you only really need a little bit. I literally just pulled this out of one of my dog's chew toys so that I can show you what it looks like. But what we can do, if you don't have some of this lying around, hey, if you have a dog with a chew toy, or if you have a stuffed animal that's already leaking some of this, you can just use that and shove it in there. But what I wanted to show you is that we can also recycle and do a lot of different things. So remember, this is like what we just trimmed off. We can use that. And this was just like some other pieces of muslin. This was like an 8x10 piece of muslin that I shredded up. So we can use that like a sample piece. And then what I did is I just had like some samples, like look this big, and I just started making like 1/2 inch cuts here. And then I can just pull it into shreds. I would say if you do this, keep them small, like maybe, 4 or 5 inches long and about a 1/2 inch wide. I think they'll give you more bulk if they're not really long and really big. You want like tiny ones. So now I have got tons of fluff, right? Like maybe even too much fluff to shove into here. And I'm just using scraps of muslin that I already had. Not very much at all, maybe like, again, a 12 by 12 inch square tops. So what we can do is start trying to fill this up into this tiny little hole. So definitely if you're using the fiberfill, it's not too hard to shove this in there because it gets so small. So because we're using our recycled filling, this might be a little more difficult. So we're just going to have to go in a little bit at a time and start filling this up. And this is another time where maybe you end up using your pencil, right? Or the end of your scissors gently to help get it in. Even when you buy bags of this fiberfill, it actually comes with a chopstick inside. And I remember thinking, why is this chopstick? But that's how you end up filling it in tiny spaces, is you need something like a chopstick, a pencil, a knitting needle, some long thin thing to stick in there to really get it. There we go. Get that in. And then you can gauge, right? I would like the pillow to be as full as this so that you can really stick pins in it and they don't come right through the other side and hurt you, right? So that so you can use it. So don't give me like some little lackluster pillow like this. I want you to see how much stuff you can really fill in there. And with these shreds, I'm assuming once you pack them in, they're going to kind of flatten. So I'm interested to see if it takes all of these shreds or less of these. And all of this is a exercise in patience. And be making sure as you're filling that you're pushing down into those corners. That's why using a pencil or a chopstick or your scissors is good. So right from the beginning, make sure that that bottom layer, before you can't really access the bottom anymore, before it's all full of stuff in your way, that you're pushing the filling into those corners. Get in there. Oops. So fill, 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 fill. I might skip ahead to save you guys watching me slowly fill this bag and then come back to you when it's full. Though I feel like I'm close. Okay, so I actually got my whole pile of muslin strips that was right here shoved into there, and it's definitely not the same look as my like fat fluffy fiberfill pillow pincushion here. It's a little denser, but I think it totally works. I think you could stick a pin in it. It doesn't come all the way through. It's got a nice heft, And I like that we've, totally recycled materials. We didn't have to buy anything else. It makes me feel good. It's like a zero waste project. So I've made sure with my pencil or chopstick or scissors, whatever I'm using, that all my little stray pieces of thread and everything are shoved in there, and it's really nice and neat, and that all my corners are kind of adequately filled, because once I close this up, I'm not going to be able to move it around, the filling around as much. So I want to now get these two pieces kind of prepped, right? So I really want to make sure that they're nice and even, just like that, nice and flat. And I actually like to take a pin at this point, a little bit below, and pin the two together, right? It'll just help me keep it really nice and flat and make sure these stay where I want them to. And I'm just even readjusting to make sure that looks just like I want it. And we'll do a slip stitch. And so I've got a good long piece of thread, maybe about 12 inches, 15 inches. I've got it doubled, so there's 2 layers, and I've got a double knot tied, and I'm gonna do a slip stitch. So this is similar to the slip stitch that we did when we were kind of hemming that little end of our sample, but also a little bit different because we're going inside something that's kind of coming together. So I'm gonna want to start by kind of putting my knot way down inside here. I don't want to end up seeing my knot, right? So I'm going to come, I'll start on this side, I'm going to come between the two pieces. Let's see if I can do it. Come kind of maybe at a different angle, come between these two pieces and then back up through the fold of the fabric, but hopefully so that my knot can live inside. So here's my knot. I'm just going to tuck it down. Sometimes even use like the back. There we go. So see, now I can't see my knot. It's on the inside, and my thread is coming out of the fold of this piece of fabric. And I'm going to come directly across to the next piece. And I'm going to do that stitch where I am sliding my needle about 1/4 of an inch in the fold of the fabric. And I can see where I've marked my stitch length, so I can do that. So now I'm coming out of this piece, and see, you don't see the float of my thread. It's in the fold. And I'm going to come directly across to the other side and do the same thing. Glide my needle about 1/4 of an inch, or even tinier if you want. You want this to be a nice tiny stitch that all your fluff doesn't come out. And all you end up seeing are barely this little prick that kind of goes across. So now I'm coming out of the fold of this side. So I'll come directly across, back to the other side, and glide my needle in the fold again. And the idea is that I'm trying to attach these two pieces with as little thread exposed as possible. So now I'm coming out of this side. I want to come directly across to the other side, but make sure that I am gliding my needle in the fold of that fabric. And now I'm coming out of this side. Come directly across. And then I'll take it in the fold right up to that last stitch. There we go. And now I'll finish by coming to that side within the fold, and I'll kind of come right out and let that sort of sit for a second. So let me take my pin out, and then I can check. I have, this is the stitch, the end stitch from our back stitch, right? That's kind of showing right now. But honestly, our slip stitch is nearly invisible. You cannot even see many, much little picks, even of the red thread, where I've attached that hole. So now my hole is all full, no fluff's gonna fill out. I can kind of test it by moving it around. Looks really good. I'd say that slip stitch, is more invisible than these stitches, honestly. And again, if we sewed this in a matching thread, you wouldn't see it at all. we're doing this for the, exercise of seeing kind of where our stitches lie. So now my big challenge is to tie a knot off with this and not see the knot, just like I sort of hid the knot inside over here. So that would be a goal again. So I can kind of open it a little tiny bit and come down towards the inside and try to grab a little bit and do my special knot where I catch a few grains and then loop it on itself. And I'll definitely want to double whatever I do. Or again, you can just take it off, tie a knot, and then kind of hide your knot, slip it down inside with your pencil or something like that. So let's see, I've got my little knot. I'm going to trim this pretty close to the edge, and then I will see if I can shove that down inside. I did it. You cannot see it. So now I've got my pincushion. It's all sealed up. I can see my nice even stitches. My slip stitch is so nice and neat, and I can test it out. Put some pins in it. I'm ready to go. And this will be your completed project. And you can show me the front, and you can show me the back. I've never marked on mine, but yours won't have the writing on it. And you could also go ahead and show me your sides, your seams, and your stitches, and you can show me your slip stitch side. So it's like ultimately maybe you'll have 4 picks, like a front, a back, and maybe one for a good side seam and one where you did your slip stitch, so I can really see that. And there we go, you're all set.